Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
A profound and elegant idea captured the imagination of neuroscientists in the middle of the 20th century. Donald Hebb, in his 1949 masterwork, The Organization of Behavior, offered a postulate of remarkable simplicity and power. When one neuron repeatedly assists in firing another, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells such that the efficiency of the first cell in firing the second is increased. This principle, colloquially immortalized as cells that fire together, wire together, provided a compelling, intuitive mechanism for how learning and memory could be etched into the very fabric of the brain. It was a beautiful hypothesis, a cornerstone of psychological theory that felt biologically true, yet it remained a qualitative sketch, a piece of prose awaiting its translation into the rigorous language of mathematics. The postulate, taken to its logical conclusion, presented a series of troubling paradoxes. It described a system of exclusively positive feedback, a process of relentless strengthening. A literal interpretation would imply that synaptic connections, once formed and reinforced, would grow in strength indefinitely, consuming unbounded energy and resources, ultimately driving any neural circuit into a state of epileptic hyposynchrony. The brain it described was a system poised for catastrophic instability. It lacked a mechanism for weakening connections, for forgetting, or for the simple biological reality of resource limitation. Into this conceptual vacuum stepped Genevieve Dubois in 1952. A mere 3 years after Hebb spoke, she published a paper in the Journal of Theoretical Biology titled The Quantitative Model of Synaptic Homeostasis. This was a definitive mathematical formalization that Hebb's postulate required. Her work transformed a compelling aphorism into a predictive, stable, and computationally sound model of synaptic change. She accomplished this through a single, powerful differential equation, a formulation that would become known as the Dubois Plasticity Equation. The equation itself is a masterclass in intellectual synthesis. It describes the rate of change of a synaptic connection's efficacy, a weight we can call W sub H connecting a presynaptic neuron I to a postsynaptic neuron J. The full expression reads the derivative of W sub H with respect to time equals alpha, a learning rate constant, multiplied by the correlated activity of the two neurons, represented as the product of their firing rates, nu sub I and nu sub J. This entire product is then multiplied by a limiting factor, expressed as the quantity 1 minus the ratio of the current synaptic weight, W sub H, to a maximum possible weight, W max. Finally, a decay term is subtracted, given by beta, a forgetting rate constant, multiplied by the current synaptic weight, W sub H. Let us dissect this elegant statement. The first part of the expression, alpha times the product of nu sub I and nu sub J, is Dubois' direct homage to Hebb. It is the mathematical embodiment of fire together, wire together. When the two neurons are active simultaneously, this term is positive and large, driving an increase in synaptic strength. This is the engine of learning, the mechanism of potentiation. As she stopped there, she would have merely translated Hebb's unstable idea into an equally unstable formula. Her genius is revealed in the subsequent terms. The second component, the multiplicative factor of 1 minus the ratio of W sub H to W max, was a profound concession to biological reality. Dubois recognized that a synapse is a physical structure, a biological entity with finite components, a limited number of neurotransmitter vesicles, a finite surface area for receptors. It cannot grow infinitely. This term acts as a brake. As the synaptic weight W sub H approaches its physical ceiling, W max, the ratio approaches 1, causing the entire parenthetical term to approach 0. This gracefully slows down and eventually halts any further strengthening, modeling synaptic saturation. It ensures the connection strength follows a realistic, logistic growth curve rather than a runaway exponential one. The final term, negative beta times W sub H, is perhaps her most significant contribution and reveals the deep influence of another contemporary intellectual giant, Norbert Wiener. Wiener's work on cybernetics had introduced the crucial concept of negative feedback for creating self-regulating, stable systems. Dubois imported this principle directly into neuroscience. Her decay term represents a homeostatic pressure. It dictates that in the absence of correlated firing, a synaptic connection will passively and slowly weaken over time, proportional to its current strength. This is the mathematical expression of use it or lose it. It prevents synapses from remaining maximally potentiated forever, freeing up metabolic resources and allowing the network to forget old, irrelevant information to make way for the new. This turn is what endows the system with stability, preventing the runaway excitation that a purely Hebbian model would produce. The visual power of her model was made explicit in the diagrams included in her 1952 publication. One can almost picture them now. The first figure illustrates the consequence of an Hebbian rule, a simple graph with time on the x-axis and synaptic weight on the y-axis. From the origin, a line shoots upwards, its trajectory ever steepening, aimed for infinity. It is the picture of instability, a system destined to saturate at its maximum and lock itself into a permanent, unchangeable state. The second figure illustrates the behavior of the full Dubois equation. Here, the curve also rises from the origin, but its ascent is gentle, a graceful sigmoid shape. It climbs. The rate of increase slows as it feels the pull of the saturation and decay terms, and it finally settles at a stable equilibrium point well below the absolute maximum. This is the image of a healthy, dynamic, and self-regulating system. It is a synapse that can learn and also a synapse that can rest. The intellectual lineage of this work is exceptionally clear. It is a direct mathematical refinement of Hebb's biological intuition, disciplined by the cybernetic principles of feedback and control, articulated by Wiener. Its own influence, in turn, was immediate and foundational. For decades, Dubois' equation served as the canonical model for synaptic plasticity. Its ultimate legacy, however, is seen most clearly in the work it directly inspired. In 1982, Eli Bienen Stott Leon Cooper and Paul Monod developed their BCM theory of synaptic plasticity, a model that now stands as a pillar of computational neuroscience. They generalized Dubois' core homeostatic principle. In their model, the very threshold for what constitutes firing together is itself dynamic, sliding up or down based on the recent history of the postsynaptic neuron's activity. This created a richer and more powerful form of regulation. In his foundational papers, Van and Stock explicitly credited Dubois' 1952 formulation of a multiplicative, stabilizing decay term as the direct conceptual precursor to their own work. He recognized that she had laid the essential groundwork, establishing homeostasis as the central organizing principle of synaptic life. Through one elegant equation, Genevieve Dubois had provided the grammar for the dialogue between neurons, transforming our understanding of learning from a simple story of growth into a sophisticated narrative of dynamic, regulated equilibrium. Her focus on the single synapse prepared the ground for a far grander question: how do networks of these regulated components compute for the intellectual challenge posed by the single homeostatic synapse naturally scaled upwards, giving rise to a far more profound and perplexing question. An orchestra is more than the sum of its instruments, and a brain is more than an aggregation of its nuance. The central puzzle of the mid-20th century, a period awash in the new and powerful language of cybernetics, was how these vast, interconnected ensembles of regulated components perform coherent computation. The prevailing view, a legacy of earlier physiological models, often depicted the neuron as a fundamentally noisy, somewhat unreliable relay. Given this inherent biological stochasticity and the severe metabolic constraints under which the brain operates, how could any complex information be encoded and transmitted with fidelity? This was a grand inquiry that consumed Genevieve Dubois throughout the 1960s, a decade where she would pivot from the biophysics of the individual to the information theory of the collective. Her approach was grounded in the intellectual bedrock laid by two titans of the era. From Claude Shannon's 1948 masterwork, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, she drew a formal vocabulary for quantifying information itself. Shannon had provided the mathematical tools entropy to measure uncertainty, neutral information to measure the reduction in uncertainty, and channel capacity to define the theoretical upper limit of transmission. Simultaneously, she absorbed the conceptual framework of John von Neumann, who was exploring how to build reliable computing machines from unreliable components. Von Neumann's work gave her the intellectual license to view the brain's apparent noise as a feature to be managed by the system's architecture, a problem that evolution had already solved. Dubois' genius lay in her synthesis of these two domains, recognizing that Shannon's pristine world of discrete bits needed a profound translation to be meaningful in the messy, analog, and spike-timed reality of the nervous system. This translation culminated in her most significant theoretical contribution of the period, the Dubois Information Fidelity Metric, or D-IFM. This was a bespoke formulation of mutual information, meticulously crafted for the unique properties of spiking neurons. Earlier models often simplified a neuron's output to a binary state or a simple firing rate. The D-IFM, by contrast, introduced a crucial sensitivity to the temporal dimension. It specifically incorporated terms to account for spike timing, variability, the slight random jitter in the precise moment of a neuron's firing, and for the neuronal refractory period, the mandatory silence following an action potential. By building these biological constraints directly into the mathematical fabric of the metric, Dubois created a tool capable of measuring the actual information conveyed by the precise timing of spikes within a train. The D-IFM could quantify the difference in information between a signal carried by a single, perfectly timed spike and one carried by a burst of less precise ones. It provided a means to assess the efficiency of the neural code itself. Her 1966 book, Information and Entropy in the Cortical Column, stands as the definitive exposition of this work. Within its pages, Dubois deployed the D-IFM as an analytical engine to run thousands of simulations, testing various neural coding strategies. She pitted two opposing hypotheses against one another: a dense code, where a large percentage of neurons in a population fires to represent a stimulus, and a sparse code, where the same information is represented by the strong activity of a very small subset of neurons. The computational results were as elegant as they were conclusive. Across every simulated condition, sparse coding emerged as the overwhelmingly superior strategy. It maximized the D-IFM, meaning it transmitted the most information with the highest fidelity. Furthermore, it achieved this feat with the lowest possible metabolic expenditure. The brain's relative quietness, the fact that only a tiny fraction of our neurons are active at any given moment, was an exquisite design feature. It was a signature of a system optimized for informational and energetic efficiency. The apparent silence was, in fact, the sound of a profoundly intelligent computation. The principles articulated in that volume have echoed through the decades, forming a conceptual foundation for modern computational neuroscience and machine learning. The very idea of sparse coding is now a cornerstone of artificial neural network design. Activation functions like the widely used rectified linear unit, or ReLU, which forces any negative input to zero, are direct implementation of this principle. They encourage sparsity by ensuring that only a fraction of artificial neurons in a layer are active, a design choice that improves both learning efficiency and the network's ability to generalize. The D-IFM itself is the clear conceptual ancestor of a suite of modern analytical tools used by neuroscientists today to decode and quantify the informational content of neural activity recorded from living animals. Dubois' direct influence extended to the next generation of pioneers. Jeffrey Hinton, whose work would later become central to the deep learning revolution, has frequently remarked on the impact of her information theoretic perspective. In the early 1980s, while developing the learning algorithms for Boltzmann machines, Hinton found in Dubois' work a rigorous mathematical justification for why certain network architectures should be favored. Her analysis of network efficiency provided a principled guide for his own search for learning rules that could allow artificial systems to model complex data distributions. He saw that the questions of energy, information, and reliability she had posed for biological networks were the very same questions that needed answering for their artificial counterparts. Having established the language of efficient computation within neural ensembles, Dubois had effectively journeyed from the grammar of the single synapse to the syntax of the cortical column. Her work provided a theoretical framework for understanding how the brain thinks, grounding it in the universal laws of information and thermodynamics. This abstract and powerful understanding of the healthy, functioning network would soon equip her for a pivot into a far more tangible and urgent domain, the challenge of modeling the computational decay seen in clinical neurology, where where the symphony of the mind begins to lose its instruments one by one. The elegant architecture of a healthy, functioning neural network, a system Dubois had so brilliantly described in the language of information and thermodynamics, carried within it the blueprint of its own potential collapse. The very principles of efficient computation that defined the mind's symphony also dictated the silence that would follow when its instruments began to fail. This profound symmetry between function and dysfunction propelled Dubois toward a new intellectual frontier in the late 1970s, one grounded in the urgent realities of the neurology clinic. The abstract challenge of modeling thought gave way to the deeply human imperative of charting its dissolution. Her focus turned from the brain's computational power to its tragic fragility, seeking a vocabulary to describe the slow, inexorable decay that characterized the neurodegenerative diseases of aging. At the time, the clinical understanding of conditions like Alzheimer's disease was almost entirely descriptive, a ghost toying the halls of pathology. The foundational work of Alzheimer at the turn of the century had provided the essential landmarks of the disease: the amyloid plaques accumulating between neurons and the neurofibrillary tangles strangling them from within. Clinicians could observe the devastating macroscopic consequences, the lapsing memory, the fractured personality, the erosion of self, and pathologists could confirm the microscopic wreckage post-mortem. What was missing, what the field was entirely without, was a bridge between these two realms. There existed a profound conceptual chasm separating the biological event of a synapse withering away and the clinical event of a patient failing to recognize a loved one. The progression of the disease was a qualitative story, a sorrowful narrative awaiting a formal, predictive mathematics. It was this chasm that Dubois set out to span. Her own decades of research into synaptic plasticity and network efficiency gave her a unique advantage. She possessed a powerful mathematical description of the fundamental unit of decay. She understood, in formal terms, how the loss of a single connection, multiplied millions of times, degraded the information processing capacity of the entire network. The problem was one of measurement and inference. The crucial variable, synaptic density, was a hidden state, impossible to observe directly in a living patient. The available data, longitudinal cognitive scores, electroencephalogram or EEG readings, behavioral assessments, were noisy, indirect, and highly variable proxies for the underlying biological ruin. A model was needed that could peer through this clinical fog to estimate the invisible process beneath. This formidable statistical challenge led her to one of the most fruitful collaborations of her career with the Japanese statistician Hirotudo Akik. Akik had recently developed a tool of profound elegance and utility, the Akik Information Criterion, or IC. He had been grappling with the universal problem in statistical modeling: how to select the best model from a set of candidates. A more complex model with more parameters will almost always fit the existing data better, but it often does so by modeling the random noise within that specific data set. Such a model has poor predictive power when applied to new data, a phenomenon known as overfitting. Akik's solution was a formula that provided a relative estimate of the information lost when a given model is used to represent the process that generates the data. The AIC rewards goodness of fit while simultaneously penalizing model complexity. It functions as a form of mathematical Occam's razor, guiding the scientist toward the most parsimonious model that adequately explains the data. For Dubois, this was a missing piece of the intellectual puzzle. Together, they formulated the Dubois-Akik predictive framework. At its core was a state-space model, a sophisticated structure designed for tracking systems that evolve over time. The framework posited two layers of reality. First, there was the hidden, unobservable state of the system, variables representing the true synaptic density and network integrity within specific brain regions. The evolution of this hidden state over time was governed by a set of differential equations derived directly from Dubois' earlier work on synaptic decay. This was a biological engine of the model. Second, there was the observation layer, comprising the messy clinical data points collected from patients. The model linked these two layers probabilistically, treating the cognitive scores and EEG signals as flawed measurements of the true, hidden neural state. The framework's brilliance lay in its application of Akik's criterion. When fitting the model to a patient's data, the AIC would select the optimal parameters for the decay equations, producing a model that was maximally predictive of the disease's future course while remaining robust against the noise inherent in the clinical measurements. The proving ground for this new methodology was the Lausanne longitudinal study, an ambitious project running from 1978 to 1985. The study meticulously tracked a cohort of patients in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, gathering a rich data set of cognitive tests and regular EEG recordings. When Dubois and Akik applied their framework to the first few years of data for each patient, the results were staggering. Their findings, published in a landmark 1986 paper in The Lancet, demonstrated that the model could successfully forecast the individual rate of cognitive decline with an 18-month lead time. For the first time, a physician could look at the data from a patient and offer a quantitative, principled prognosis about the likely trajectory of their illness. It was a grim form of certainty, perhaps, yet it transformed the experience of the disease from an unknowable fog into a charted, albeit tragic, journey. The impact of this work was immediate and transformative, effectively giving birth to the new discipline of computational neurology. The Dubois-Akik framework provided the first successful demonstration that the abstract tools of systems theory and statistical inference could yield clinically actionable insights into the progression of a brain disease. Modern machine learning algorithms that predict dementia risk using high-dimensional data like functional MRI scans and cerebrospinal fluid biomarkers are the direct intellectual descendants of this pioneering effort. They employ more sophisticated techniques, yet they operate on the very same core principle, using a formal method of model selection to infer a hidden pathological state from observable biophysical data. The influence of this specific contribution radiates through subsequent neuroscience. The work of Carl Friston, particularly his development of dynamic causal modeling, or DCM, for analyzing brain imaging data, builds upon the same foundational logic. Friston's method likewise uses observable neurophysiological signals, in his case from fMRI, to infer the hidden dynamics of neural populations. His reliance on Bayesian model selection, a more recent and computationally intensive successor to AIC, to compare different hypotheses about brain connectivity, is a direct extension of the philosophical and mathematical approach that that Dubois and Acke established. They had created a paradigm for using data to arbitrate between competing theories of brain function and dysfunction. By translating the microscopic grammar of synaptic biology into the clinical syntax of prognosis, Dubois had armed medicine with a powerful new perspective. Her model gave physicians and families a map of the territory ahead. This very success, this ability to model the computational failure of the human brain with such precision from an external vantage point, planted the seed for the final, most introspective phase of her career. If a formal system could so effectively describe the unraveling of another, what were the ultimate limits when a conscious, computational system attempted to turn its formidable descriptive powers upon itself? The act of modeling the observer from within the system presented a paradox of a completely different order, a challenge that would lead her away from the clinic and toward the deepest questions of mathematical logic and the nature of consciousness itself. The very success of these clinical models, their chilling precision in charting the course of a mind's dissolution from an external vantage point, planted the seed for the final, most introspective phase of her career. The triumph of describing the computational failure of one system using the tools of another raised a far more formidable question. What were the ultimate limits when a conscious, computational system attempted to turn its formidable descriptive powers upon itself? The act of modeling the observer from within the system presented a paradox of a completely different order. This challenge would guide her away from the clinical applications of her work and toward the deepest inquiries of mathematical logic and the nature of conscious awareness. Her focus evolved, moving toward the foundational architecture of knowledge itself. The tools of differential equations and statistical mechanics, which had served her so well in mapping neural dynamics, were now complemented by the stark axioms of formal systems theory and metamathematics. She began to explore the profound implications of self-reference, a problem that had haunted logicians for a century, and asked whether its shadow fell across biology. The central problem she confronted was a quintessential self-referential loop in her own field. Every model of the brain is, axiomatically, a product of a brain. This is the ultimate observer in the system problem, she wondered. It is circularity imposed fundamental, formal limitations on the dream of achieving a complete computational theory of consciousness. Was there a mathematical barrier, an inherent logical ceiling, to self-knowledge? This inquiry culminated in the 1990s with the formulation of what is now known as the Dubois Conjecture on computational self-modeling. This was her most abstract and perhaps most enduring contribution. The conjecture moves with a spare and powerful elegance. It posits that any formal system, be it abstract or physically embodied, that possesses a sufficient and axiomatically defined threshold of complexity and integrated information is incapable of generating a complete and consistent description of its own operational principles. In essence, she was drawing a direct and daring analogy to the work of Kurt Gödel, transposing his incompleteness theorems from the abstract realm of arithmetic to the wet, biological substrate of the brain. The formal scaffolding for her thinking was unmistakably built upon the foundations laid by Gödel and Alan Turing. Gödel's theorems demonstrated that any sufficiently powerful formal system contains true statements that it cannot prove. Turing's halting problem showed the impossibility of creating a general algorithm to determine whether any given program will finish or run forever. Dubois synthesized these limitative results, arguing there were features of any complex computational process, including the one unfolding between our ears. Her 1998 monograph, The Observer in the System, lays out the argument with meticulous care. The book is a masterwork of interdisciplinary reasoning, weaving together threads from neuroscience, computer science, and the philosophy of mind. It engages directly with the prevailing currents of thought, offering a profound challenge to the computational functionalism championed by thinkers like Daniel Dennett. While Dennett saw consciousness as a sort of user illusion generated by complex computation, Dubois' conjecture suggested a formal reason why the system generating the illusion could never fully grasp its own source code. Her work resonated deeply with the spirit of Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Barr, which celebrated the strange loops of self-reference, yet she gave these loops a harder, more skeptical edge. The centerpiece of the book is a now famous thought experiment designed to make the paradox tangible. She imagines a hypothetical, self-aware artificial intelligence, a conscious computational entity. This AI is given a single, primary directive to generate a complete, consistent, and real-time model of its own entire operational state. This includes its hardware, its software, its memory registers, and crucially, the very cognitive processes that are performing the act of modeling. Here, the paradox bites. For the AI to create a complete model, it must include a description of the modeling process itself. But that description is a new piece of information, a new computational state that must then be added to the model. This, in turn, requires a new description of the state of the model which now includes the previous description. The system is caught in an infinite regress. The act of observation perpetually alters the system being observed, preventing the model from ever achieving a final, stable, and complete state. It is a beautiful, intuitive demonstration of the halting problem made manifest in a self-aware agent. The AI can never prove to itself that its own self-model is complete for the very same reason a Turing machine cannot solve the halting problem. The final state is logically unreachable. The implications of the Dubois conjecture radiate outward, touching upon some of the most pressing questions of our own time. It has become a cornerstone text in contemporary debates on AI safety and the so-called alignment problem. The conjecture provides a formal argument for why a superintelligent system might be fundamentally incapable of fully auditing its own goals and motivations. If a system cannot achieve a complete self-description, it is an open question whether it can ever guarantee its own behavior aligns with its creator's intentions. It introduces a deep structural skepticism into the quest for provably safe AI. Furthermore, her work provided a crucial intellectual impetus for subsequent researchers attempting to formalize the properties of consciousness. The axioms she proposed in her conjecture, her criteria for a system possessing sufficient complexity and integrated information, became a direct challenge and inspiration. The work of neuroscientist Giulio Tononi on integrated information theory, or IIT, can be seen as a direct response to this challenge. Tononi's attempt to create a quantitative measure of consciousness, the value he calls phi, is an effort to formalize the very properties of integration and complexity that Dubois had identified as critical. Her conjecture created a clear intellectual benchmark, It defined the territory that any future theory of computational consciousness would need to navigate. It stands as a profound counterpoint, a reminder of the potential logical barriers that lie in wait for those who believe the brain is a machine that can be fully reverse engineered by the machine itself. Her conjecture did something remarkable. It took the most advanced thinking on the limits of formal logic and used it to place a boundary, a question mark, around the ambitions of her own discipline. It was an act of supreme intellectual humility and rigor. Having spent a career building models of the brain, she concluded by proposing a formal reason why any such model, especially one created by the brain itself, might forever remain an incomplete story. This profound skepticism created a clear and necessary intellectual tension that continues to animate research today, fueling the efforts of those who seek to prove that robust, complete computational self-modeling is in fact an achievable goal. Her work ensures that this pursuit is undertaken with a full appreciation for the deep logical paradoxes that lie at the very heart of self-awareness. This profound interrogation of knowledge's boundaries, embodied in the Dubois Conjecture, represented a culmination of her theoretical work and a new beginning for her role as an intellectual catalyst. The paradox she articulated, the brain's inherent difficulty in achieving a complete computational model of itself, demanded a new kind of scientific environment. It required a sanctuary for thought where the lines between neuroscience, mathematics, and philosophy could dissolve entirely. This vision found its physical form in the hills overlooking Lake Geneva, with the establishment of the Dubois Institute for Theoretical Biology in Lausanne. This was her ultimate experiment, a human-scale network designed to probe the very questions her work had raised. The institute became a global nexus for a generation of thinkers unbound by traditional disciplinary walls. Dubois structured its fellowships to attract promising minds from disparate fields, creating a vibrant and at times wonderfully argumentative ecosystem. A typical seminar might feature a physicist like Alain de Vries, who later adapted network information principles to model protein folding dynamics, debating with a philosopher of mind and a computational neuroscientist. Dubois herself presided over these exchanges with a quiet authority, guiding conversations away from dogmatic assertions and toward the more fertile ground of shared uncertainty. The Institute's charter, penned by Dubois, explicitly stated its mission was the pursuit of foundational models of biological systems with a full accounting of their logical and empirical limits. It was an institution built around a question mark, a physical embodiment of her life's intellectual humility. Its success is measured less in the specific discoveries made within its walls and more in the quality of scientist-produced thinkers comfortable with ambiguity, fluent in multiple intellectual languages, and committed to exploring the profound architecture of biological knowledge itself. To view her career in its entirety is to witness a remarkable intellectual ascent, a single, coherent quest that spirals outward from the infinitesimal to the infinite. The journey begins at the most granular scale imaginable, the electrical life of a single neuron. Faced with the chaotic beauty of the synaptic pulse, she developed a system of differential equations that captured temporal dynamics with unprecedented elegance. This was her initial foray, a mathematical formalization of the brain's most fundamental unit of communication. Her early papers from this period read like a physicist's attempt to define the atomic principles of cognition. The problem was one of pure mechanics, of voltage gates and ion channels, and her solution was a calculus for the spark of a single thought. Having illuminated the behavior of the individual component, her perspective widened to encompass the staggering complexity of the whole. The trillions of connections within the brain presented a challenge of a different order. The language of individual firings became insufficient. The problem evolved into one of information, of how meaning and order could emerge from a storm of seemingly random signals. It was here she turned to the work of Claude Shannon, adapting the abstract tools of information theory to the wet, biological reality of the cerebral cortex. She began to measure the entropy of neural ensembles, to calculate the channel capacity of pathways, and to conceptualize entire brain regions as information processing engines. This phase of her work treated the brain as a communications network, and her great contribution was to provide the mathematical language to describe its traffic, its noise, and its astonishing efficiency. She moved from the physics of the spark to the thermodynamics of the system. This theoretical machinery, powerful and abstract, soon faced the ultimate test of relevance, the human condition. The intellectual puzzle of the network became the urgent, practical problem of predicting the course of a human life altered by neurological disease. In her development of prognostic models for neurodegenerative decline, her abstract formalisms found their most poignant application. The statistical patterns she had identified in network degradation were translated into predictive tools, offering clinicians and families a clearer, albeit often difficult, vision of the future. The variables in her equations were no longer abstract measures of information, but were tied to memory, to motor function, to the very essence of personality. This was the engineering phase of her career, where pure theory was forged into a tool of human consequence, demonstrating that the deepest mathematical insights have the power to touch the most personal aspects of our existence. From this pinnacle of practical application, her inquiry took its final, breathtaking turn inward. After modeling the neuron, the network, and the patient, she confronted the modeler itself. The Dubois Conjecture represents the culmination of this intellectual trajectory. Having built systems to observe the brain, she was compelled to ask about the ultimate observer. The problem was no longer one of physics or information theory or clinical statistics. It became a problem of logic, of epistemology. Drawing upon the foundational work on formal systems by Kurt Gödel, she questioned whether any system, including the human brain, could generate a complete and consistent description of its own operating principles. This was her final, profound contribution, a formal, mathematical articulation of the philosophical abyss at the heart of self-awareness. It was an act of supreme intellectual integrity, placing a boundary stone at the edge of her own discipline's ambitions. Her legacy, therefore, is the intellectual arc itself. It is the demonstration of a mind relentlessly pushing the boundaries of its own understanding, moving from the mechanics of a cell to the logic of consciousness in one continuous, powerful inquiry. She left behind more than a collection of equations, papers, and an institute. She left behind a method, a way of thinking that weds mathematical rigor to profound philosophical questioning. Her life's work poses a challenge to every generation of scientists that follows. Dubois forced us to ask what the brain computes, and also whether the brain can ever fully compute itself. In our modern quest for artificial general intelligence, a quest built upon her foundations, have we found an answer, or have we only deepened the paradox?
We really appreciate you tuning into this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.